So what I want to start with tonight is this discussion about strength training. And this is chapter 6 in the Uphill Athlete book. And it's primarily tonight what I'd like to do, like we did when we started talking about, the basics of endurance training. We started with some really fundamental, kind of theoretical discussion in terms and principles and that kind of stuff. So tonight's going to be rather general, although at the end I'll still start getting into the weeds a little bit about some specifics. But I want to save most of the specific training methodology and whatnot, for which occurs in, I think it's chapter 7. I want to save that until our next meeting. So this is going to be kind of a 30,000 foot view of everything, but primarily hopefully help get folks all on the same page in terms of terminology and that sort of thing. So again, please, let me know if you have any questions. Stop me along the way. Just, feel if I don't happen to, if I'm not paying enough attention to where if you got your hand raised, just, shout out and say, hey, wait a minute, I got a question. I don't think anybody will mind. We're all friends by now. So recall in that very first discussion, what I talked about was that endurance is primarily a metabolic effect. It is the ability of, and we're talking specifically about muscle cells here, it is the ability of the metabolism to turn over and create ATP, to recycle ATP. You might remember that metabolism is essentially a recycling plant for ATP. ATP gets broken apart. The energy that comes out of it is used in the process of contracting muscles, and then it's reassembled. The molecule adenosine triphosphate is reassembled in using the energy in the food that you eat. So that makes it a metabolic or a process or an effect, in that we can train the metabolism to turn over ATP faster, and we've been through all that, so I'm not going to go into it. But I think it's important to understand that strength is primarily a function of the nervous system. Yes, it involves muscle cells and the ability to contract those muscles, but what is contracting those muscles is the nervous system. And we're going to talk tonight. I want to talk a lot about strength and power and the difference between the two, because I think it's really important when it comes to athletics and sports, and even endurance sports, where power is a big component. So as you can see there, what I've defined strength, and I think this is a good general definition, is that strength is the ability to generate a high force through muscle contractions. And that would mean, in a joint where the muscles are contracting. We do have some muscles that don't go across joints. They still, of course, can apply force. But the ones that we're going to be primarily thinking of are the ones where the muscles cross a joint and are responsible for moving that joint. Now, you might remember from your high school physics that the work that's done on something is the force, or in this case, strength, really. The strength that's exerted, or the force that's exerted, times the distance. So it's that strength that's applied over a distance. And that's dependent on the number of motor units that get recruited. And they need to be coordinated. As you can imagine, an uncoordinated firing of all these motor units in the muscle is, if they're not fired at the same time or in the right order, you're going to get an uncoordinated movement. And anyone who has, we're going to keep this, I can talk about challenging technical sports or challenging technical processes, even something as simple as playing a piano that requires, your fingers to apply force to the keys of the piano in a very coordinated way. But we can think of something, on bigger picture, broader scale, like lifting a dumbbell off the floor, lifting a barbell off the floor. There's there's ways to do it properly. There's ways to do it that are dangerous even. And that requires learning that movement and basically teaching the motor cortex of your brain to fire the right motor units in the right order so that you can complete this movement, something as simple as, stepping up onto a box, let's say, or lifting a dumbbell or barbell off the floor. Now, power is actually something that we're more interested in when it comes to sports than we are at strength. And I'll get into that more later. But power is basically the rate at which you can produce this force, or the rate at which you can produce the strength. And I think it becomes pretty apparent if you think a little deeply about it, that the strongest person doesn't necessarily will not necessarily be the most powerful person. Having a lot of strength can help you become powerful, but being strong does not mean you're powerful. And likewise, someone who isn't particularly strong can be very powerful if they can create the force quickly enough. If they can generate that the number of motor units that are needed to contract to, let's say, bend the joint with that muscle, then that's going to be more powerful than someone who may be stronger but can only apply this force over a much longer period. And we'll talk a little more about that here in a few minutes. But it's very dependent on the rate at which you can recruit those fibers. And I think you can understand why that might be more important in sports than it is in, let's say, weightlifting. Weightlifting, they're not timing how long it takes you to get that bar off your chest to, in a bench press, for instance. There's no time involved in how long it takes you to lift that, do a deadlift and get the bar up into a standing position. There's no time involved in that. So power is not, which is kind of weird because, in fact, so the term powerlifting is a complete misnomer. There's no power involved well, there is some power, but power is not a determining factor in powerlifting. Pure strength is, because they don't care how long it takes you to move that barbell. Now, Olympic lifting is a completely different thing. It is very much a power sport. And we'll talk more about Olympic lifting here in a few minutes. But I want to get this point across that, the nervous system is what's allowing you to be stronger and or powerful. And we can train the nervous system through repetition and through, let's say, we'll talk about the max force or max strength training in our next talk. But basically, we can train the nervous system to recruit more muscle fibers and recruit them faster to be more powerful through particular training methodologies, which probably many of you are already pretty familiar with. And so the way this works is, initially, this comes from the motor cortex, which is one of those, it's a part of the brain that's pretty close to the spinal cord. I mean, it's kind of probably one of the earliest development part of the mammalian brain. I mean, it's something we probably inherited from our distant ancestors, because that's what controls motion. And when we're first learning a movement, let's say lifting that barbell or jumping up in the air, whatever it is, we have to think about that. When we have to think about doing a movement correctly, we're having to engage the frontal cortex. That's kind of our reasoning part of our brain. And we're having to sort of think through. And so any of you that ever even learned a simple lift like the deadlift, understand there's a lot of components to that. And when you were first learning it, if you had a coach, they were correcting you and you were taking in that information and you were absorbing it and you were analyzing it in your frontal cortex to make sure you were doing it properly. That's a pretty complicated process, and it slows the whole thing down greatly, the whole process of lifting that barbell off the ground, doing it correctly. However, once the skill becomes deeply ingrained into the brain, the motor cortex learns which of these motor units you can see I've got those little, this is obviously quite a, simplistic schematic here, but we've got the motor unit, which to recall what that is, it's the nerve and the muscle cells, the muscle fibers, interchangeable, that are innervated by the signal that's coming out of the brain. So it's a combination. A motor unit is the nerve that actuates and the muscle fibers that are actuated. That's what they call those, a motor unit. So once you've learned a skill and you become masterful at it, then you're no longer having to engage that frontal cortex to think through that movement. It gets done at a much lower level in the brain, much closer to the spinal cord, in the motor cortex, and it's sped up dramatically because of that. That's one of the reasons when we watch athletes, masterful athletes, people who have truly mastered the skills that they're demonstrating, we're impressed by how smoothly and efficiently and how easy they make it look. It's because they're no longer having to think about those movements. They're so well ingrained. And any of you, I haven't rewritten the article that's over on Uphill Athlete, but it's I talk about there in an article about myelination. And so these motor units, the nerve part of the motor unit is covered on the outside by this substance called myelin. And the more that nerve is innervated, the thicker the myelin around it becomes, the sheath of myelin. And you can think of the myelin sheath around those motor nerves as insulation on an electrical wire. The better it's insulated, the less leakage there is, and so the stronger the signal that makes it down to those muscle fibers. And so the ones you train, this is why I think I've talked about in technique training in a number of other places. If I haven't mentioned it in this lecture series, I've been remiss, but basically I think I've mentioned or said this, that if you practice a skill wrong many, many times, all you do is get really good at doing it wrong, because those motor nerves that are being energized and innervated to fire those motor units and the muscle cells, they get that myelination formed around them. And so they get really good at firing those muscle cells in perhaps the wrong order, the wrong sequence, the wrong muscles, even the wrong fibers. And so you get really good at doing it wrong. That's why training technique, it's so important when you're training to learn a new skill, first that you do it when you're rested, because if the nervous system is already fatigued. So this is why, let's say if a person was saying, we get people like this, Dave, who's on the call, Dave's our rock climbing coach. We see this all the time. People want to train for endurance, like long distance running or mountaineering or something, and they want to train for a sport like rock climbing, and which is a high skill and high strength sport. And maybe even something like bouldering. So if you go out and do, a 2-hour run in the morning, and in the afternoon, evening, you're going to go to the climbing gym and try to boulder hard or do a campus board workout or something that requires a lot of power, a lot of force, and a lot of technique, the nervous system is going to already be in a pre-fatigued state, and it's not going to be able to fire as effectively. So when we have the option, when we're working with someone like that, we would say, hey, you need to go do this, this bouldering workout in the morning and then do your endurance in the afternoon, because you can always go do a zone 1 or 2 run when the nervous system is a little fatigued. It's not going to diminish the results of that run very much at all. Whereas if you flip-flop them, and you want to do let's say you were going to do an endurance run in the morning, and then you were hoping to go do hill sprints in the afternoon to build power for your running. Well, that would be a bad idea for the same reason. Your nervous system is going to be dulled down, and so it's going to be difficult to fire those fibers. And it's also going to be difficult if you're trying to learn a skill. So that's kind of a takeaway for, like, put the speed and power training first and the endurance training later. So anyway, back to the when we look at these elite athletes, performing their skills and they make it look so easy. The reason it's so easy is, again, they're not having to think about it anymore. It's just happening. And when those skills also involve a lot of force or a lot of power, especially, that's when it's even more amazing. When we see elite athletes perform high skill, high power activities and make it look easy, that's when it sort of takes our breath away. It's why we all tune in and watch the Olympics and things like that, to see just that kind of thing. It's sort of the epitome of the ultimate of human performance. So anyway, that's kind of the basics of what's going on there. And now I want to talk about, I don't know how many of you have ever read the first book that I worked on, which is the Training for the New Alpinism. And I did quite a lot more writing about strength training in that book because it was more important in the sport. Well, not more important, but maybe it forms a bigger part of strength of the sport of alpinism and mountaineering, because there's so much vertical, and oftentimes the climbing can be against a high resistance. Maybe you've got a big pack on, or maybe the climbing is very challenging. So strength training, I felt in that book, was really important. So I reached out to a good friend of mine, Tony Yaniro, who was one of the granddaddies of modern strength training for rock climbing. Many of you may not know his name because he's very under the radar kind of guy, but Tony was really innovative in developing a lot of the kind of strength training that's been used for rock climbers now for the past 25 or more years. And so Tony, at the age of 17, was the first person ever to build a wooden mock-up of a particular climb. And he climbed the hardest climb in the world when he was still in high school, 17-year-old. It was and maybe still is rated 513B. It's called Grand Illusion. It's in California. And he built this plywood mock-up in his backyard and trained on that. And this was in the late 70s. So a very forward-thinking guy. You might have heard of, and I just mentioned, campus board training. Tony invented campus board training. And then in discussion with Wolfgang Gulick, who was the person who made campus board training famous, Wolfgang, essentially, according to Tony, essentially stole the idea, took it away and trained with it and saw great results, and also named it campus because he trained in a campus gym with it. So anyway, not important, except that Tony's a very clever guy. And when I asked Tony to help me write this part of the book about training for strength, he came up with this novel idea of explaining it by using the piano mover analogy. And for those who are going to be listening to this later, I'm going to read this. Those of you who are watching can read along with me, and it'll be on this slide. But I think it's a great way of thinking about how the muscles work when it comes to strength training. So here goes. Louis formed a piano moving company with a few guys, the motor units. At first, these guys were not very good at moving pianos because they were not very strong, nor could they lift or pull in coordination. With practice, however, they became pretty darn good at piano moving and began to get the requests to do more jobs with bigger pianos. Louis, being the brains of the group, literally the brain, realized that he could recruit more guys and get more work done. He'd have to serve them all lunch. He'd have to take them to all the jobs, but hey, it was a no-brainer. Well, those guys turned out to also be kind of lazy and bumbly, so much so that they got in each other's way. They dropped pianos. It was kind of a mess. So Louis decided he had to give them more supervision and train them to work as a team. Sure enough, after a few weeks, even these new guys were really good at moving pianos. But geez, could they pack away the lunch? They were eating them out of house and home, but the jobs kept coming in, and now Louis was making real money. But then the bottom dropped out of the piano moving market, and Louis was still obliged to take all these guys, transport all these guys, many of them now kind of worthless. They're workers, to take them around to all the jobs that he could find, just in case the new work came in. So he needed these guys kind of in reserve. To make matters worse, he still had to feed them. It became obvious pretty fast to Louis that this was no way to run a business. He needed to reduce his crew to just the number of guys he needed for the immediate job. Now, I hope everybody gets that analogy. I thought it was very clever of Tony to come up with this. But basically, what he's getting at here, and I'll get to this in the next slide, we can talk about it maybe in more detail then. But what he's talking about here is you can add more muscle, and you can train those muscle fibers to become very strong and become very coordinated. But you got to carry those things around with you. Now, if you are, if you're an Olympic weightlifter, a bodybuilder, power lifter, whatever, you can afford a lot of those guys. You can carry those guys around in your truck. You can feed them as much as they want to eat. And so when Louis needs them for a big moving job, he needs every single one of them, and they need to be sharp and ready to pull together as a team. But the endurance athlete, the marathoner, the alpinist, the military athlete, can't afford either the cost of the lunch nor the cost of carrying all those guys around that he may never need to put to work, and probably won't. And we'll talk about why he probably won't. So the endurance athlete has to have a kind of a minimalist crew, but that crew of muscle fibers have got to be so well trained that they can handle any of the moving jobs that come their way. In other words, they got to be able to handle the amount of force, the amount of strength, or the amount of power that's needed to get the job done in whatever that endurance event may be. So anyway, the idea with that is that as an endurance athlete, you got to carry all this muscle mass with you. And we often see people come to us who have quite a background in strength training. And when you tell them, you're probably way stronger than you need to be for these kinds of events that you're training for, it can often also be a bit of a problem for them to accept that, because it's fun to be strong. It's fun to feel like you have a lot of strength and can overcome whatever force you're dealing with. But luckily for most of us, it's not that big a deal. And I'll talk about why. So for athletes, now I'm not talking about, obviously people would dispute me on this, but I'm going to lay it out there. Bodybuilding is not a sport. It's an aesthetic pursuit. It's not an athletic pursuit. Unfortunately, it's pretty much hijacked modern strength training to the point where I think it has had such a disproportionate influence on the way people train for strength that they've forgotten how athletes should train for strength. And what an athlete wants, and this is somebody who has, and especially an athlete, which is most sports, are in a sport that you have to propel yourself. Now, and it's even more important for endurance athletes because they have to propel themselves for a long distance. But even if you look at, I'll get to that. I'll come back to that in a minute. So the reason an athlete wants to strength train is, number one, they want to improve their sport performance. And number two, and they often don't realize this or don't take advantage of it, they should be strength training to prevent injury, or they're doing it to rehab from an injury. And brings us to that third point down there, which is they're not training to get stronger in the gym. And this is something I have seen over and over and over again in my long career coaching. And it has a couple of reasons. One is, so the world of strength training can easily take place within the four walls of a gym. And if you talk to strength training coaches, that's about most of them, not all, most of them, that's about as far as their vision will extend. And I've worked with Olympic athletes who were trained at the highest level by, some of the best strength training coaches in the world. And the myopia that existed with some of those strength training coaches, that they wanted this young cross-country skier who was, on the U.S. ski team, Olympic team, to work on their snatch or their clean and jerk. And yeah, those are cool things to know how to do. But are those going to enhance this athlete's performance as an endurance athlete? Very, very unlikely. And I'll talk about why that is in a few minutes. But my experience with strength coaches, and Rob, this is not directed at you, so please don't take this personally. I don't know your strength training back. I know you're a strength training coach, and there are some enlightened strength training coaches out there. but I think I'm going to call them the unenlightened strength training coaches. Maybe it's because the way they're trained is to help the average citizen who trains almost exclusively in a weightlifting gym to either not hurt themselves and to get stronger. But let's say you're an athlete, you're a runner, you're a mountaineer, like training your bench press to run a better marathon, that's sort of stupid. I mean, why would you be doing something like that? It has nothing to do with your sport. And you've, as an endurance athlete, you already know that it takes a huge amount of time to train for endurance. You don't have the time or the energy to spend needless hours in a gym doing training that has nothing whatsoever to do with either improving your sport performance or injury prevention. You've got to get in the gym, do the best work you can, and we're going to talk about what that work can look like here in a few minutes, and not go in there and try to just get better at, let's say I'm using bench press because it's probably one of the most overrated and misused exercises in the world. I was at a strength training conference with, and I've forgotten his name now. He's one of the most famous strength coaches out there. I've forgotten his name. I'm blanking. Sorry. I'll try to put it in the show notes later. Anyway, he had this remark. He said, anybody who ever finds themselves on their back pushing up has done something really wrong in sports. So, and that was his opinion of bench press. And he was training NFL players. So he's training big, strong guys. But anyway, you need to maximize, or find the best use of your time when you're training for especially endurance sports that take so much time and energy. Now I want to talk about a couple things, stepping away from my diatribe or my, whatever I call that, my rant, and talk about these two things are going to become important as we begin to move through this discussion. So for every joint in our body, and some non-joints, we'll talk about some of these things later in terms when it gets to specifics, but there are the muscles that are principally responsible for bending or moving that joint. So when we, very simple, one would be thinking about the biceps brachii, the bicep muscles in your upper arm. When you flex your elbow, you can see that the bicep muscle is the one that is doing that's doing the work. But there are other muscles around every joint that act as a stabilizer. And sometimes these roles are exchanged. A stabilizer muscle isn't always a stabilizer, and a prime mover isn't always a prime mover. But depending on the way the joint is being moved, you need to have some of these muscles that are surrounding the joint keep it stable so that the prime movers have the best advantage that they have in producing the most force as that muscle contracts. So I hope that's kind of clear. We'll get into why this is so important, and hopefully we'll get to that tonight. About the difference between why we need to train both prime movers and stabilizers, and especially in our sports. So and now this brings us to another question, which is the strength versus power for endurance athletes. Just how strong do you need to be? How powerful do you need to be? Well, this is something that I think a lot of us don't take into enough consideration, that most endurance sports, almost all of them, are never going to use much more than about 25 to maybe 50% of an athlete's max strength. Maybe they're going to use 50% of the maximum force, but only for a very short period of time. Generally, and the longer the event, the lower this percentage of your maximum strength is. So someone who's doing multi-hour events, the proportion or the percentage of max strength that a runner in a multi-hour run is probably down in the teens, maybe even lower than that, because you just can't. We'll talk about muscular endurance later. You just can't produce that much force for very long. But in contrast to that, you can use 75% and an even higher percentage of an athlete's maximum power. So think of the Tour de France, which has been, is over now, but when it was going on, I'm sure many of you saw that. So for most of those, the duration of those multi-hour bike ride races that those guys were doing day after day, they're producing probably on average, 25 to 50% of their maximum strength, maximum power. We'll talk power. But in that, on some of the bigger climbs and certainly in the sprints to the finish, they're probably in the 90 or even 100% of their maximum power that they're able to produce. So power is actually a bigger component that we need to be thinking about and talking about than is maximum strength. Now, you can potentially become more powerful by becoming stronger, but we're going to talk in a few minutes here about general versus specific strength, and that's when we'll talk about how you can train both of these things, or if you need to even worry about training strength for, if the forces required to do your sport are not very high, like ultra running, for instance, or even mountaineering, then do you really need to be training a lot for strength, or would you be better off spending that time training for power? Okay. So this is a really interesting question because, and I should have had a question mark there, but when you increase your max strength, there is a relationship, your muscular endurance will go up. So you can, and I think this would be intuitive to someone. I'm going to use a climbing specific. So a general strength for climber would be something like a pull-up. That's a good general strength exercise for climbers. If you can increase the amount of weight that you can hang off your body and still do a pull-up with, there's a very strong correlation with the number of pull-ups you can do, or which is more of a muscular endurance effect. And I've written about this, and you might, if you haven't got it, then it's in training for the new alpinism. I have a pull-up program in there to help people increase their maximum strength. It involves using weighted pull-ups, and it will increase the muscular endurance. I've done it with a number of people over the years, where 8 weeks of that program, they will double and even triple the number of pull-ups that they can do. And that works really well when you're dealing with a fairly small muscle mass where the central pumping systems, the heart and lungs, are not a huge factor. So, very few of us are going to get out of breath doing a pull-up or even 10 pull-ups. So you can, if you increase the strength of relatively small muscle groups, you will increase their muscular endurance. However, when you're dealing with large muscle mass, like let's say would be used in cycling or running, then increasing the max strength no longer correlates very well either with local muscular endurance and especially with global endurance. If it wasn't true, then power lifters or Olympic lifters, they would be the best marathoners because they're the strongest. And we see that's not true. And it's obvious. It's because they don't have the cardiovascular pumping system and the endurance that's needed to complete a marathon. But at what point does getting stronger no longer correlate well or improve endurance performance? And that is a question that has no answer. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then this time and next time, I'm sure, about how big of a role general strength and increasing your general strength needs to play in your training in hopes of increasing your endurance performance. And I think that there's probably almost as many studies about this in sports as anything else, is like how strong do athletes need to be. And there's no, I can't tell you, you need to be able to deadlift twice your body weight, or those would be nice numbers if we had something like that, but it doesn't exist. And I'll talk about why, and also talk about how you might evaluate some of this for your own self. So now we're going to talk about general and specific strength. So general strength training, like general endurance training, doesn't need to really look like your sport. Typically will not look like your sport. It's like you could do endurance training if you're a runner by swimming or bike riding, and that would be general. It doesn't necessarily look much like your sport, and as a consequence, it may not transfer over very well to your sport. Doesn't mean it's worthless. It just doesn't necessarily transfer over to improved performance. This would be, so with general strength training, we're typically looking at to kind of strength training you do in a weightlifting gym. Barbell type work. I mean, these are the most popular types of weight, and this could go to, we could be talking about machines and things like that. Although I think machines are best left. I mean, machines were invented, the whole Nautilus weightlifting machine, which some of you are way too young to remember, but this guy invented the Nautilus, which is that changes the resistance as the weights are lifted. It's a machine that he invented to train bodybuilders because it changed the leverage as the joint moved through its full range of motion, so that when the joint was the weakest, the person had the most leverage over the weight, and when the joint is strongest, you had the least leverage, and so more resistance. It was a very clever idea, but it was designed for bodybuilders. Now, machines have come a long way, but many people are making machines like this. And I feel there's nothing really wrong with using weightlifting machines, especially if you're a bodybuilder, but also if you are rehabbing an injury or prehabbing to prevent injury, then they can become really useful. But I don't think they should play a particularly big role for most healthy athletes. And the reason is that they just don't look enough like the sport, because they're meant to isolate quite a small muscle group and train that small muscle group, but in a isolated way that has really can have very little to do with the sport you're training for. If you want to get big biceps, then a machine like that in a gym can work really well, but that's again not the point of training for most sports. So the reason barbells are so popular is that they're extremely effective. So weightlifting is a really effective way to get strong. No doubt about it. I mean, it's been around for forever, probably. And I think that it can be in a very, very effective way. But as I was saying earlier, it often isn't the most sport specific. And it's very easy to get caught up in trying to improve, again, I'm going to pick on the bench press again, trying to improve your bench press just to improve your bench press. It has nothing to do with your sport, because there's, when you're in a weight room, there's competition, there's a social effect, that you can very easily track your performance improvement. And I've seen even pretty high level athletes get pretty wrapped up in what's going on within those four walls of that gym, rather than thinking about, okay, how do I take this out and apply it to my sport? The other issue with a lot of these barbell lifts is they're typically bipedal, meaning you got both feet planted squarely on the ground when you're lifting the weight. The two most common lower body exercises, squat and the deadlift, which are great exercises, but for most of us, especially those of us involved in endurance sports, we are locomoting on one foot at a time. And these bipedal, the reason people can lift they can lift way more than twice what they can lift on one leg when they've got both feet on the ground. And try to say that again a little more clearly. So if you want to lift as much as you can, you want to put both feet on the ground, because that's the most stable position. And it allows you to recruit more of those prime mover muscles to lift that heavy weight. So whereas if you were having to stabilize your hips, let's say, in the case of a squat or a deadlift, you would need to be recruiting a lot of stabilizer muscles in the hip and lower legs to make sure you didn't fall over when you were doing this squat or a deadlift with a heavy barbell. So, and as I said, if you can deadlift, 200 pounds with both feet on the ground, it's highly unlikely you could do a deadlift of 100 pounds with one foot on the ground, because the recruitment that's needed to keep you stable is going to take a bunch of nervous energy to do that. So, but because we are endurance athletes that have to propel ourselves on one leg at a time, then I think it's really important to do your general strength on one leg at a time. And so you get more specific if, as endurance athletes, you do most of your strength training in a single leg with one foot on the ground, because that's what your sport looks like. At some level, all footborne sports. Let me think if I can think. I've thought about this before, and I can only think that, let's say maybe an NFL lineman who pushes against another NFL lineman with both feet on the ground, or a Nordic ski jumper, who, when they take off from the jump, is pushing off equally with both feet. But in almost all the other sports I can think of, everything from team sports like baseball, soccer, basketball, football, the running people in the football, and certainly in mountain sports that we deal with, you're doing it one leg at a time. And so I think it's important that unless somebody is extremely weak, let's say they can't deadlift their own body weight, that would be someone who I would say is pretty much on the weak side, and they probably would benefit from increasing their strength in these bipedal activities where it's safer before moving to stuff that's single leg. So why we even bother with general strength? Well, the first one I think is important is to help protect you against injury. So the connective tissue, principally the fascia surrounding the muscles and the tendons that connect the muscles to the bone, those things need to be stressed, and we can stress them quite highly with heavy loads that we can do in a gym with a barbell. And those, because they'll become stronger if they see a lot of force, the tendons especially. So there's a really a good reason to do general strength, just to increase the strength of your tendons and the fascia, because the fascia is what's controlling or keeping the muscle in alignment. The other thing is to improve certain deficiencies, and we're going to talk about valgus knee, that's caused by weak gluteal muscles in your hips. And we'll talk about what that means here in a few minutes. Actually, next slide, in fact, and why it's important to have good hip stability. And so this would be another case where doing general strength, whether it's in an extreme case with two legs, or in some cases with single leg exercises, which I'm going to show you here in the next slide. And maybe you are just generally weak, like I mentioned in that last slide. Maybe you cannot even deadlift your own body weight, or maybe you can't do a pull-up. So when you're in a situation like that, and I'm only throwing these two things out there as examples of a case where I'm very, very confident that if you fit into one of those two categories, or both those categories, increasing your general strength at those kinds of activity will actually improve your endurance performance. Whereas, if you're already comfortably deadlifting, 1.5 to 2 times your body weight, then it's highly unlikely that increasing your deadlift is going to make you a faster runner. I think it might, but I think there's much more effective ways to improve your running performance than increasing your deadlift. And we'll get to how some of those ways here shortly. Similar for a pull-up. I mean, if you can do 15 pull-ups, then working to do 20 pull-ups or 25 pull-ups is probably not going to increase your climbing performance, that kind of general strength. So that much we can say about those things, even though it's, I said to you before, there's no one really knows the answer, but in those extreme cases, I think we know the answer. So here's just a few single leg general strength exercises that I think almost everybody in locomotive sports, like what we do, running, hiking, skiing, can benefit from. And then, as you can see, most of them do not require almost any equipment. So the box step up, what I like to do with people in general is they use a box that's from the bottom of their kneecap down to about somewhere in the height of the box should be somewhere in the range from the bottom of the kneecap to roughly about 3/4 of the height to the bottom of the kneecap. So, for a 6-foot guy, that's going to be somewhere in the range of 16, 17, 18 inches, somewhere in there. And it's again, single leg, requires a lot of hip stabilizing to get your hip over there. And, I like to have people start with with no weight at all. And you can progress this. And if you don't have a barbell, the beauty of this is, you can load up a backpack with water jugs or sandbags, or you can put a weight vest on to do this as you get stronger. This is a great thing. This barbell box step up is a great thing to do in a gym, because most gyms are going to, many gyms, not most probably, many gyms are going to have a squat rack. And so you can drag the bench or the box over to the squat rack, where you can rack the bar with a fairly heavy weight. For those, I've had people who are very strong and they needed to be using, with this for a single leg box step up like this, they're going to be in the 150-pound range. And so in order for them, if you had to do that at home, getting 150 pounds on your back in the form of a backpack or sandbags or something, it would be very difficult to do that. Whereas if you are in a gym, and the squat rack just makes this whole operation a lot easier. So you can rack the bar at about shoulder height, and it's safer, easier to handle. And then the other exercise is the step down. It's akin to the step up. It's the step down. So you're stepping off of a box. And for most of us, this is going to need to be a considerably smaller box, probably at half the height of the step up box, because most of us are going to be weak at this. And I'm not going to talk too much about the muscles that are involved in this, but this is the downhill muscle. And for those of you that know a little bit about the anatomy, there's a muscle that's shaped somewhat like a teardrop on the medial or the inside of your knee, just above the kneecap. It's called the vastus medialis obliquus. And this is probably one of the best exercises for targeting what's called the VMO. And that's also one of the muscles that gets worked the hardest on, let's say, running downhill. So the box step down is a great way to train that. And it can be obviously trained without weight or with weight. The other one is the Bulgarian split squat, which is, pretty darn simple. You're just elevating that rear foot onto a bench, and you can see her feet in this diagram are spread apart. The reason a normal split squat would have the back foot on the ground, but this Bulgarian split squat really puts the load on the front leg dramatically. And this it works the whole gluteus group that's involved in both stabilizing the hip, but also in moving your femur in the hip. So it's a great exercise for that. The other one is that single leg Romanian deadlift. You can see there's a woman doing it there. Similar thing, really targets the glutes. And so all of these things are, they're working other muscles too, but they really do hit the glutes. Even the box step up and the step down hit the glutes pretty well, because you're on one leg, you've got to keep the leg, you've got to be stable standing on that one foot. And that means all the stabilizer muscles. And in this case, those are going to be the gluteal muscles in the hip that are getting worked. The sled push is another one of my favorites. If you don't, I'll tell you about how I used to use the sled push and the drag. So by putting like a strap around your waist and walking backwards, dragging a sled, these are two, again, very straightforward and pretty simple exercises. You could do these with, putting your climbing harness on and going to the local wrecking yard and getting a big truck tire and just dragging it around in the alley behind your house. I've actually had people do that. One of the guys that we trained for Denali years ago, he liked this so much that he took his riding lawnmower, put it in neutral, and dragged it back and forth in his alley literally behind his house, which I thought was very, very clever of him. But doing this both forward and backwards is a great, again, good for hip stabilization, good quadriceps and lower legs. It works the whole package in a even though we would call this general, these are general strength as compared to, well, we're going to talk about power here in a few minutes, but these would be a great basis for anybody in almost any footborne activity sport to use. Now, what I used to do with my skiers, because I hadn't thought of the sled drag and I had too many of them, we would go in the parking lot of the high school and we would take their cars and I would have, one kid put his back against the car and push backwards like that backwards sled drag, and push it like he'd run out of gas and trying to push it to the next gas station. And then he'd push it like 50 yards, and then the other kid would push it back. And they would do several sets of this, and then I would have them turn around and then push the car like that upper picture there with the sled push. So, being creative with, had a bunch of kids. It was a great way, and they had fun with it. And it's a really, really effective way to make your legs stronger. Okay, let's see. Power. Now I want to chat a little bit about power before I kind of think I'm going to run out of what to stop after. Actually, I'm almost done, if you guys can bear with me. So, power. So this is what's more important for any athlete and endurance athletes. So if we can increase your sport specific power, it will undoubtedly increase your endurance performance. And how that works is, if we can increase your power, we're going to increase your running economy because your stride length is going to go, or even your hiking economy or your uphill hiking climbing economy, because you're going to be able to take a bigger stride up the hill. And we're going to also be able to increase your speed because of that increased stride length, and especially in running. And so being more powerful gives you a longer stride length, which improves economy and speed. Great ways to do this: hill sprints, single leg hops and jumps, which I'll show you here in a second. And this is where the Olympic lifting thing comes in. So when I was at the Olympic Training Center with the skiers, which is in Park City, Utah, and they had brought in these Olympic lifting coaches from, I don't know where they got them, but these guys were all about snatch and clean and jerk, which are very powerful movements. They're also, especially the snatch, is incredibly difficult to learn, to do it properly and safely. But they would spend hours with these skiers in the gym, first teaching them to do it safely, with a very light bar, and then secondly, trying to help them improve their Olympic lift. And my thought was, we should be out on the hill behind this gym doing hill sprints, because that looks a lot more like their sport than a clean and jerk. And while the clean and jerk and the snatch will definitely make you more powerful, that time spent could be better spent in something that's more sport specific. So one of my favorites, a couple of my favorites are these. So for power, like single leg hop. So this is, even though you can't quite see it in the diagram, he's on one foot only. So we'll say this foot right here is going to be, let's call it his right foot. That's closer to us. Oh no, it's actually the left foot, because it's behind, I can see in this other picture. So he's on his left foot here. He's compressing in this picture, extending and hopping up, flying through the air, and then landing on that same foot. And this is another drill I used to do with the skiers. We would have them do 5 single leg hops for distance. And this is a general power training modality or method, but it's easily transferred over into something very sport specific that looks like this. This is a cross-country skier bounding up a hill. You can see he's got poles, both feet very far off the ground. And that would be, you could do this general strengthening in a gym in the off season to condition yourself and build general power in your legs, so that you could then take it outdoors and do something that looked like what this guy on the hill is doing. And that's one of my favorite ways of building power on the legs, is with this, is hopping. Yes, somebody asked? Question? Nope. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about very little about muscular endurance, because I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about muscular endurance over the next 2 talks we do. But so this muscular endurance is the ability to expend or create a near as high a percentage of your maximum force as you can for as long as you can. And of course, if the event you're training for is short, then you're going to be using a much higher percentage of that maximum strength. And so maximum strength becomes more important in a short, powerful activities. So let's say sport climbing, modern sport climbing at, at a high level, that is strength endurance, but it's a fairly short event, especially if you are going to, climb through a crux, for instance. It may take you a minute. Then you're going to be exerting quite a high proportion of your maximum strength, but only for, maybe a minute or so before you get to a place where you can rest again. And so it's sustainable strength, but it's or durable type strength, but it's very much related to the length of the event. Whereas when you get to events that last several hours, then you can see that the maximum strength isn't as important, because the forces required for those multi-hour events are much lower. And so you don't need to have quite as high a maximum strength. And we'll talk again, like I said, later about how to train for muscular endurance. But the cool part about this is, number one, it's very, very trainable, and it is a big contributor to overall endurance performance. I think it's actually one of, my feeling is probably, outside of things like the things you can't change, such as your genetics, max VO2 and things like that, the improving your muscular endurance will do more to improve your endurance performance than almost anything else you can do. And by what that means is it is directly related to your sustainable speed. And so especially this, and as you might remember that we, in one of our last talks about, I talked a lot about max VO2. Also, you could call it VO2 max, doesn't matter. Everybody knows what this means. That there are three things that are the primary determinants of endurance performance. One of them being that maximum oxygen consumption. The other being the speed at your anaerobic threshold. And the last one being your economy. Now, as I mentioned, in that last talk, max VO2 has the least correlation with endurance performance of those other two, and it's also the least trainable. And so, especially for all of us, we're adults, and many of us have been training probably for many years. Your max VO2 is probably what it is, and it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to change it. Whereas speed at anaerobic threshold and economy of movement are highly trainable. And I literally, even with Olympic athletes, I've seen double-digit gains in their performance by focusing on speed at anaerobic threshold and economy. So that's where I like to put a lot of my emphasis, as you probably have figured out by now. Now, I want to talk a little bit about assessing this, because this is also in this chapter. But so this valgus knee thing, and this comes from weak hips. And a good way to test for it would be either have someone step up onto a box or step down off of a box. So you can see that in the dark blue on the left, the hips have shifted slightly to the left and to keep it balanced, but the knee is lined up pretty well over the toes. Where this valgus knee, which is the knee kind of collapsing, caving in, and the hip moving to the outside, outside of the knee, puts your femur, you can see this, the femur would be along this line right here over the tibia and fibula right here. That creates a nasty alignment, and this person could potentially become injured with a lot of use if they don't correct this. And the easiest way to correct this is to strengthen those gluteal muscles in the hips. And very, very simple exercises I've used with lots of people are doing like air squats with a band around the knee, or this sort of single leg stance with kicking your leg out to the side. We used to use this a lot with the cross-country skiers because it simulates some of the hip strengthening that you'd use in skating, the motion of skating on skis or even skating on ice. But anyway, these are some really simple ways. If you can assess your own self, if you step up onto a box or step down off of a box, it'll even show up more so there, and your knee caves in, very far at all, or your hip moves out like this person's having to do, then you got weak hips, and you need to strengthen those things, because running a high volume on hips like this will potentially give you injuries. This can be, so this is called valgus knee with flexion. Now, some people have valgus knee without flexion, just standing straight, meaning that their femur come in like this. The colloquial term for that would be like knock knees. It's not a very polite term, but yeah, that's what it's called when both the femurs angle in and the knees touch. And you won't see elite level runners with that kind of skeletal problem. They're going to have straight legs lined up over it, and it's going to be. But if you have valgus, either I don't know how they correct valgus knees other than with orthotics. If you have, like, when you're standing straight, if your knees go valgus, but if your knees, you can stand on a straight leg, but then when you bend it, you get this knee caving in, then that's just a sign of weak hips, and it's very easy to deal with that. Okay, well, that was my last slide for tonight. I had to rush through some of these. Next time, we're going to talk about methodologies for training these various things. So any questions on what we covered? I know I've kept you a little bit over time, but we had those technical difficulties at the beginning. Apologize for that. So any questions? And if you think of them later, please put them in the book club section on the forum. I'll be happy to answer them there. But if not, if nobody has any other questions, we will call it an evening. We all good then? Okay. Well, we'll get this thing posted on YouTube as soon as we can, so that if you need to look at it again or want to share it with friends or something, please do so. Again, last time, anybody have any questions? If you want to stay late, please do. I'm happy to stay around for a while and answer questions. But if you need to leave, by all means, go ahead. Thank you again for attending. Mark, looks like you might have a question.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if you'll get into it in the next talk. I'm certainly happy waiting, but how do you assess in like let's say a level 2 athlete from your from uphill athlete, or I don't remember if it's level 2 or type 2. Anyway, how do you tell how much power is too much power to train for an endurance athlete? Or how do you tell?
That's a really good question. I think it's similar to the strength question. And I did, one of the things I didn't talk about when we were talking about this slide right here, and is that there was a very interesting study done probably almost 20 years ago now when I first read it, that everyone thinks, justifiably so, as we just talked about, endurance is a metabolic quality. So everyone for a long time has assumed, okay, you just increase the ATP turnover, increase people's metabolic rate of turnover, energy turnover, and you're going to increase their endurance, which is true to a point. But just to complicate things a little bit, this guy named Laursen, I believe is his last name, Laursen, researcher, decided to test correlation between some power activities and 5 kilometer race times, and which would be more of a metabolic, energy turnover, because 5 kilometers is going to be somewhere in the 15 to 20 minute range for a decent runner. And so what he did was he found that what was it, like the 20, I think it was like a 20 meter sprint, the distance a person could cover in those 5 single leg hops, which so you take 5 distinct single leg hops on one foot and then measure that distance. And there might have been 1 or 2 other tests that he did, but those were the 2 that jumped out at me, which now you can see why I had my skiers doing this 5 single leg hops. But what he found was there was a very strong, like, R squared correlation of like 90%, 0.9 between their sprint time and how far they could hop on one foot and their 5K running time. Now, I haven't heard of anybody doing that with long distances, but it makes sense to me that, as I've talked about in other writings, that if your stride length is 2 inches longer, if we can increase your stride length by an inch or two, and then in your event, your race, let's call it, or even in your mountaineering, doesn't really matter. But if you can go travel an inch or two farther with each stride, and you're taking, 20,000 strides in a, whatever 100 kilometer race, then you're just going to be that much further ahead. You're going to be that much, you're going to cover so much more terrain, much territory with each step, that it's going to have a pronounced effect, I think, even on long distance events, maybe more so than even on the short ones. I'm not sure. But, and where I've seen this in action is we take someone like Tom Evans, who's a very fast runner in general, and he's doing very well in ultra distance running, even though he's relatively new to that sport, because he travels so much farther through the air. So I don't have a hard answer for you, but I would wager that because we use, as that one of those slides I put up earlier, endurance athletes could potentially use 75% of their maximum power in their event. Now, you won't be using that all the time. If you're running 100 miles, you're not be using 75% of your maximum power. But I think you can see that there's a much stronger correlation between power and endurance performance than strength and endurance performance. So I would say there's more. I'm making very general statements here, but say that it's more important to be powerful. And so there's probably, I've never met an athlete, even someone like Tom, who I've been working with for a couple of years, who has not benefited from power training. So with Tom, we do it primarily hill sprints. And so even at his level, he can benefit from hill sprinting. So I would say for most of us that aren't at that elite level, we can benefit, and you needn't worry that you're too powerful.
Okay.
So I don't know if and it's not a hard answer. I guess I just don't have one. So yeah, Rob.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Scott, everybody. So, piggybacking off of Mark's question, how you can tell you're too powerful, I guess the thing that occurs to me too is how can you tell whether you might need to devote more of your limited training time to power versus muscular endurance, in the sense that, for example, if you're whatever event you're doing, you know that power training will benefit you by allowing you to go a little further with each step. But then you also know, of course, on the whole, you need to be able to maintain that over the course of your event. So I'm kind of wondering, maybe this is also like a lead off of that question, which is being able to gauge at what point is it that we need to lean a little bit into the power training versus muscular endurance. I think that's my basic question.
That is a great question, because that's really the gist of all of this strength stuff is, first we have to develop the power, because if you could only hop 2 feet in, when you're hopping on 1 foot, if you only go a meter, let's say, that's not very powerful. And so you have no hope of sustaining a high power output for a long time, which would be the benefit of muscular endurance. So first you would need to develop power. And that's why we could use power in the base phase. And you might remember in a lot of my writings and in the book and in most of the training plans that we deliver, we do hill sprints almost the whole way through a plan. Not
Right.
Total beginners probably, because there is some risk of injury because you're putting down a lot of power. But I typically use hill sprints all the way through, and I have found very good results with so my strength will be, and let's say with somebody who we're not concerned too much about general strength with this person. So this person, has decent general strength, and we want to focus on power. So I'll give them strides and hill sprints, and later begin to introduce muscular endurance workouts, either in the form, if they're mountaineers, it might be, carrying a heavy pack uphill. If they're runners, it might be that gym muscular endurance routine. And I maintain the power, the speed type training with the hill sprints and or strides through the whole period. So the 2 strength workouts for the week basically one of them is either a stride or a hill sprint, and the other is a muscular endurance workout. And I've had tremendous luck with that, from everybody, again, from mountaineers to ultra runners.
Great, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So, but I think, you have to, it's like another clever quip by my friend Tony Yaniro was that, and this, I think you'll be able to get the analogy here, that it was related to climbing, but it was, if you can't pull the move, you got nothing to endure. So likewise with this, I mean, if your single leg hop is less than a meter, then you need to build that up, because you got nothing to endure. I mean, you're too weak, or you're too unpowerful. So build that power first, then extend it into muscular endurance.
Got it. Makes sense.
Okay. Anybody else? I saw a couple people joined late. I'm sorry if you got confused about the time. This always happens at 7 Mountain Time. But this is recorded, and it will be on our YouTube channel, and so it'll show up on the book club on the left side of the website's homepage. There's a place where you can click on the book club. It'll take you to the YouTube page, and then every one of these sessions is there as well, so you can listen to it there in completion. And likewise, if you've got questions, please just put them in the forum on the book club, the book club part of the forum, because if you've got questions, I suspect other people do too, and it'd be good for the whole community if they can see that stuff. So, all righty, everybody, I'm taking off for Chamonix day after tomorrow, headed over there. I got a bunch of people running in the UTMB races that week. So I'll be if I don't respond to you, that's why. If I don't answer questions, it's because I'm traveling, and it's going to be kind of a hectic week. But I will get back to people, if you put stuff on the forum. So, Steele, you have a question.
Ethan, Scott, just had a quick question regarding core, because general versus specific strength for a lot of the traditional Olympic lifts, I see how the more specific strength of some of the stuff you featured tonight would be more useful. But core seems like you can always use more core, and then in specific for Olympic lifting, deadlifts with how they target kind of your back core. I don't know if that's the correct technical term.
Yeah.
At what point do you have enough? At what point can you always kind of use more?
Well, here's an extreme example. Could you do a front lever? If you can do a front lever, you have adequate core strength. Let's just put it that way. So I think that core strength, the main core muscle that I think that all athletes need to be focused on, and we're going to talk about core strength when we do the methodology part, or probably our next talk. But the primary muscle that most of us need to have strong is the transverse abdominis. So the transverse abdominis is essentially like a girdle that wraps around your entire core, and it basically holds your guts in. It's the deepest core muscle. It attaches to the spine. It attaches to the pelvis, the lower ribs. And when it is flexed, as you might imagine, your core becomes a stiff cylinder connecting shoulders and hips. And so it creates a very stable platform for any kind of movement. And so, if you're doing a quadrupedal activity like cross-country skiing or rock climbing, where you need to have you're engaging all 4 limbs, and you need to be able to connect those 4 limbs, the transverse abdominis is the muscle you're trying to train. I'm going to get into more detail in a second. And for running, if you want to have stable hips, you need to have a strong transverse abdominis, because you can imagine if your pelvis can rock from side to side like this, that is not going to be a very effective, your hips aren't going to be stable. And that's going to result in lost motion and potential injury. So the problem with training the transverse abdominis is it doesn't move. It's not it's not affecting a joint. So you can think of the oblique muscles in your core, or more the famous rectus abdominis, the six pack. That the rectus abdominis is designed to flex your spine. Likewise, the spinous erectus on each side of the spine on your back, they're designed to extend your spine to make it straight. Those muscles all involve movement. It's very easy to engage them with exercises. Obviously the crunch or the sit up, or the back extension. Those things are pretty easy to get engaged because they involve the movement. Likewise, if you want to engage the obliques, you can rotate the shoulders and spine in opposition to one another. And that's what the oblique muscles help do. And so again, their movement. The problem with training the transverse abdominis is that it's buried underneath all this other muscle, and it doesn't move a joint. And so it's pretty hard to activate. And a lot of people have a really hard time engaging the transverse abdominis, but I think it's probably the key to having a strong core. So the best exercise I know of for that is planking. And there's all kinds of variations on planking. There's the one of our favorites that we use, and I know Dave uses it a lot with the climbers. I use it with a lot of people, is we put our feet into like a TRX strap, and you get into a planking position. So that would be with elbow, forearms on the ground, and then you saw your body back and forth, called a saw plank. And you can extend a great deal, which puts more force on the transverse abdominis, or you can retract and come over your elbows and have a little bit less force. So you can do reps like that. But planking, I think, is probably the best way to train the transverse abdominis for increased core stability. That kind of probably took the wind out of my sails when we talk about core training. I mean, there's a lot of ways to train core exercises. The internet is full of them, and probably 99% of them are totally perfect and good. That little core routine that I put out years ago in the Training for the New Alpinism, we call it the Killer Core. It's just a bunch of random core exercises. They work great. I designed it so when skiers were traveling, they didn't have access to a gym, they could do that workout in a motel or a hotel room. There's a lot of ways to train core, but I just think that the transverse abdominis gets overlooked just because it's buried and hard to activate.
No, thanks for that answer, Scott. Sorry for stealing your thunder for next week.
That's okay. We'll have a new audience. We can talk about core next time. And hopefully we should be able to pull this off end of September. I would hope get something done by then. So everybody, until then, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. And you keep your eye out for an invitation for the next one of these meetings.